very delighted to be here and a little daunted because I'm going to be focusing in my contribution to this panel on the question of whether sustainable growth is possible. So not just the question of whether it's desirable, but whether it's actually technically possible. That's a very daunting question to be looking at hot on the heels of a presentation by a man who's done more than most to draw the dots between the economy and the environment. It's a question that I get asked a lot at the Centre for Policy Development these days, because we're running a sustainable economy program that's looking at how we can build a prosperous economic future for Australia in the context of global resource scarcity and environmental limits. We look at the economic footprint of environmental assets. We're all familiar with the idea of the environmental footprint of the economy. We kind of flip that upside down. For example, we've been looking at the extent to which the fishing industry in Australia depends on the health of our ocean, we've got a report coming out next week which looks at the importance of investing in healthy soil if Australia is to capture the benefits of the coming food boom. And we also look a lot at the policies that will enable specific industry sectors to flourish as they adjust to environmental and resource limits. So this question comes up a lot, I'll kind of skip to the end and give you the Twitter version for those of you who have short attention spans. Maybe is the answer. Is it possible to grow sustainably? The positions in the answers to this question can be placed on a spectrum. At the one end, you have this perspective. Sustainable growth is impossible, and growth is a bad thing anyway. Small is beautiful, we were better off before we grew so much, we should basically just try and shrink our population, shrink our consumption back down and save the planet in the process. Then there's this perspective. Growth was nice while it lasted, despite some of its flaws as a measure of progress, but it's over now, whether or not we like that. You can only have infinite growth on a finite planet in iTunes downloads and derivatives markets, and that ain't enough to power broader economic growth. Then there's the optimists. We're a smart species. We can completely decouple economic growth from environmental damage and resource depletion if we just put our minds to it. We can have closed-loop production, we can have 100% renewables, we can shift to the growth in services rather than stuff, health, education, entertainment, don't diss the iTunes downloads. Then there's the Panglossians. Don't worry, our models tell us that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Not only can we grow sustainably, but only growth will save the planet, because richer people place a higher value on clean air and conservation. I'll start with that last position. This is one that I've started hearing a little bit more about recently as the economics of environmental assets have become more sophisticated. You start finding, for example, Treasurer Wayne Swan turning around and saying, okay, well, I hear you're no jobs on a dead planet and I'll raise you. We can't save the planet without money. We can't save the planet without growth. And it is true that growing economies with noisy activists and effective institutions will often clean up some of the mess they've made once they reach a certain income. This is mainly true, however, for certain types of environmental damage, where one, the source of the damage and the people who are damaged by it are close together, like urban air pollution. Two, the damage is visible and easy to understand, like the floaters that used to turn up on Sydney's beaches before we cleaned up our sewage systems. Three, the damage is pretty easy to reverse and there are simple alternatives available, like when the world got together to successfully shrink the hole in the ozone layer. Other types of messes tend to get worse as economies grow. For example, the kind of mess where the source of the damage and the people who are damaged by it are far apart. Far apart in space, like the wine growers and people drinking tap water in South Australia are far away from Cuddy Station, or far apart in time, like the future generations who might have to deal with temperatures that are 3, 4, 10 degrees higher than they are now. But you might say, doesn't the carbon pollution produced per dollar of GDP go down as economies grow? Yes, but not once you include the carbon footprint of imported goods. Manufacturers outsourced a lot of greenhouse gases along with all those jobs in heavy industry. As larger, richer populations keep demanding more resources, the prices of those resources will keep going up. Economies often adapt to rising prices by improving efficiency and reducing consumption. It's great for the planet, right? But in some cases, rising prices can lead to even more unsustainable behaviour. Rising oil prices lead to investment in CO2-intensive tar sands. Rising fish prices encourage fishers to invest in more equipment to catch the dwindling stocks of fish. And it can take a hell of a lot of efficiency gains to reduce the impact of a growing economy. In rich countries so far, efficiency improvements of around 2% a year have not kept pace with economic growth of around 3% a year. Now, these issues might work themselves out in the long term, but our economy has been unsustainable for so long, we don't have time to wait and see. So we can't just stick with business as usual and hope for the best. So the next question, is it possible to save the planet and grow the economy at the same time? There are some signs that we can. The United Nations Environment Programme's Green Economy report found that while short-term growth would be lower, long-term growth would be higher if we made the investments necessary to have half a chance of keeping global warming under 2 degrees. Of course, if you pay close attention to the science, it's clear we actually need to go the more than half a chance of keeping it under 1 degree, but the principle is the same. After the big oil shock in the 70s, US GDP rose 27% while its oil use fell 17%. Bhutan puts its national happiness, gross national happiness, ahead of growth, and its environmental footprint is less than 1, so it's using less than its sustainable share of the planet's resources. But its growth rate is still positive, so it's prioritising something else, but it still has a positive growth rate. Then there's the fact that averting climate change will require some pretty rapid economic restructuring, mainly of our energy sector, but also it's quite likely we'll need very rapid changes in manufacturing, transport, building, etc. We've seen a major transformation before in the US during World War II, when up to half of the total economy was diverted towards military activities within a few years. Yet despite this massive shift, and despite the fact that personal consumption was rationed at the time, the economy still grew rapidly. Now, economists have been described as people who look at something that works in practice and ask, but does it work in theory? I've seen one plausible theory on what growth might look like in a zero-carbon economy, and I'm sure Robert could tell us about it a lot more, based on the fact that GDP is nothing more than the sum of private consumption and investment plus government spending. You shift all that consumption, investment and spending away from goods and services that use up resources and damage the environment and towards those that don't, like energy efficiency, human capital, natural capital, renewable energy, closed-loop manufacturing, low-footprint human services. Voila, you've got yourself a growing GDP with a shrinking environmental footprint. I think it's important not to dismiss people who argue that 100% decoupling is impossible, however. I think they have some quite good points. They point out that decline in damage per dollar just isn't good enough unless total damage is declining, and growth can make that harder. So with 2% annual growth, the greenhouse gases emitted per dollar would have to fall on average by over 11% a year to stabilise the climate, which is 16 times faster than they've fallen over the last 20 years. What this means is that the more convinced you are that growth is essential to well-being, the more committed you have to be to 100% decoupling. You therefore need to accept that growth can only take place within a couple of limits. In the medium term, the environmental footprint of the economy has to shrink much faster than the economy grows until it's back to a sustainable level, at which point it has to shrink at the same rate as the economy grows. In other words, the future rate of growth will depend on how fast we can increase resource efficiency and reduce pollution. 2, the climate footprint of a national economy can't exceed its share of the world's carbon budget. Because the world is so close to having used up our entire carbon budget for the next 4 decades, some countries may find it easier to keep their carbon budgets in the black by slowing growth in the short term, as well as rapidly increasing efficiency and reducing pollution. Think of it this way. Any economy that destroys the environment that sustains it is heading towards a brick wall. If you're driving a zippy little economy with a great turning circle, you might be able to avoid hitting that wall without taking your foot off the accelerator. If you're driving a great hulking road train, you might be wise to slow down a little to give yourself some turning space. That's exactly what China is doing now by deliberately slowing its growth rate and decreasing the energy intensity of its economy at the same time. If, on the other hand, you're convinced that growth is inherently damaging to the planet and must be stopped, you'll need a very solid understanding of how to maintain employment and incomes without growth. Obviously for social justice reasons, but also because increases in unemployment and reductions in income can have a very negative impact on public concern about environmental issues. I think there's some good news in this picture, which is that in the medium term, for people who accept climate science and other environmental science and care about human well-being, the steps we need to take look remarkably similar, regardless of your stance on growth. How am I going for time?
You've got a couple of
Excellent. Okay. So those steps include non-negotiable science-based limits to pollution, specific policies designed to help each sector of the economy adjust to those non-negotiable environmental limits and flourish within them. Investment in innovation, rapid shift to 100% renewable energy, rapid increases in energy and resource efficiency, reducing inequality. If you're pro-growth, you'll need this to make sure that people are willing and able to redirect their consumption investment away from environmentally damaging activities. You need that social cohesion to take that on as a shared project. If you think that growth is over, you'll understand that that's now the only way to bring poor people out of poverty. We need to either adjust or replace GDP as a measure so that liquidating natural assets or racking up environmental liabilities can't be counted as economic progress, and there are some really important steps underway globally to do this. The World Bank WAVES project, if people have heard of this, has a whole bunch of countries signed up to pilot environmentally adjusted GDP measures. I think that's a really important project. Australia, of course, has been a real pioneer in the alternative measures of progress. The Australian Bureau of Statistics wellbeing indicators, some really well regarded internationally. And we were just talking before we came up about the fact that if you look at some of those broader measures of progress, it's interesting that Australia often does really, really well. If you look at the OECD Happy Life indicators and so on, Australia measures up quite well. I'd argue actually that the point that you made about the disconnect between how miserable the tone of public debate is in Australia and how we all moan about the cost of living and how hard things are, and how well the stats actually measure up compared to the rest of the world, is part, I think, actually of a fear of loss. It's not about where people are now. They're afraid that this is as good as it gets for Australia. And I'd argue there are probably some good reasons for that fear. There are a lot of things that we haven't been paying attention to that we need to deal with in terms of broad structural issues, the need for investment in infrastructure, the shift towards two-tier systems in health and education that put us on that US path, but complete inequality of opportunity, and of course the liquidation of a lot of our natural assets. 1 minute? All right. Yep. So, I think that point that, Robert, you made in question time before, that for a child to become a healthy adult, it must grow in size, and for a mature adult who wants to avoid obesity, growth has to mean something very different. That's really a great way of thinking about it. That growth in knowledge, skills, adaptability, relationships, experience, quality of life, even if we didn't need to rapidly adjust to environmental limits, those of us living in mature economies could benefit a lot from shifting our focus to that kind of growth.